Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is George Hajecek. George holds a position of Director of Business and Technology Development at MDS Aerosupport. MDS is a world-leading supplier of validation technology in areas of aviation propulsion and industrial power generation. In his current role, George works with the business development team to integrate new capabilities related to decarbonization and reducing carbon footprint of test facilities. George has been with MDS since 1995 and has a broad background in both business development and engineering. He is a professional engineer. He holds 2 master's degrees as well as an undergraduate degree in engineering from Carleton University. Ambitious gentleman, George. And I understand you're ready to talk about the possibility of a new testing facility, and perhaps I'm sure you will start with what you're currently doing in Thompson. So over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Barry. And a pleasure to be here, and really looking forward to presenting and having some good questions on the topic. Okay, all right. So first off, just a thank you to the task force and for having me as part of it. And I sort of came to this a few years back through our presence in Thompson, and MDS's presence in Thompson. And when I heard about this, I immediately grabbed hold of it because I firmly believe in the airships as a technology for where we are right now, as a very suitable, very timely technology. And so I'm very, very excited to be a part of it. And I know there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm very, very hopeful. As is our good man, Barry. So thank you, Barry. Okay, so today I want to talk about cold weather test capability for airships in primarily in Thompson, Manitoba, and understanding the viability, desirability, and the feasibility of what this is going to look like. But first, I want to talk a little bit about innovation. And first, I want to tell So innovation to me is a success. And for success to take place, you need to have 3 things. You need to have feasibility. So technically feasible, viability, and desirability. And there also has to be that opportunity. And some will say necessity, but I say opportunity. And I want to talk a little bit about Canadian innovation. And one story that I came across a while back is from the 1970s. And it was a period where Japan was doing a lot of export of consumer goods to Canada. And so Japan was sending these aircraft, these jets full of consumers' goods to Canada, and then only one out of every 8 was going back with anything. And so some fishermen in PEI realized that there is a huge market for tuna, sushi grade tuna in Japan, and that they could be sending their tuna to Japan on these jets, and these jets would get them there in a timely fashion. And the cost would be relatively low because the planes were going back anyway. Are you guys seeing the pop-ups on my screen, or do I? Okay.
Yeah, they're coming through, but it's okay.
Okay. Let's see if I can hide that somehow. Okay. Another great story of innovation is the Glacier Test Facility that is in Thompson, Manitoba. And this is a facility that does icing certification for jet engines, for gas turbines that are used for aircraft propulsion. And it is a joint venture between Rolls-Royce and Pratt & Whitney. And fundamentally, it grew out of the need for more economic testing of aircraft engines. So MDS was involved in this project. We worked with our 2 partners to find a site, and Thompson was the perfect site based on the environmental conditions. So based on not just the fact that it gets cold there, but it gets a certain kind of cold, and there's a certain number of days where they have the appropriate test points that aircraft engines need to get tested. So just wanted to show a couple images of the facility. And this has proven to be a huge success for both MDS and for Thompson, I believe, in terms of bringing technology. and opportunity. So just a few pictures of what the test site looks like. So fundamentally, the gas turbine is hung off the test stand, and positioned in front of it is a long tunnel, which when you spray water into it, that water, it converts to ice crystals. And then the ice crystals, they form on the leading edge of the fan. And from there, they're able to study what happens when ice is forming on the fan and when it sheds. And this is also required for certification. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's quite beautiful. So there's a lot of technology involved in getting the engine ready for test and actually running the engine. Here's a picture of the team that's involved in it. So not only do they do icing tests, they also do endurance testing in the off season. So as a younger engineer, I think it was 20 years ago, I was able to participate in the development of this facility, and I spent some very long nights up in Thompson building this. So why did Glacier work? Why was Glacier a success? And fundamentally, Glacier was a better mousetrap, because prior to having this facility, what the engine OEMs were doing is they were sending their engines to test in facilities that were indoor, where the environmental conditions were being created through machines, through chillers, through blowers, and essentially the cost to create that was exceptionally high. Whereas in Canada, we get a lot of that for free. Mother Nature gives us all of that for free, and so the opportunity arose to build a facility and to convince some of our OEM partners that this would work, and that combined with a lot of gumption and a lot of desire for success and opportunity. Right, there was that opportunity. So, what is the opportunity for airships? So in my mind, and I think a lot of people's mind, the airship is a better mousetrap when you compare it to some of the existing technologies that are available for getting cargo to remote places. The cost per ton is lower, and I think very importantly, the technology fits with a global mandate for decarbonization. I would say in the last 5 years, our focus on test on aircraft has very much been towards shifting our thinking to a lower carbon footprint, and we're exploring a lot of with customers, exploring a lot of different cases for the use of hydrogen, both as a fuel and as fuel cells, and for hybrid electric propulsion with distributed power. Okay, so in the north, opportunity is that there is for the transport of goods, the transport of cargo, medical supplies, housing, and mining and forestry. And through the task force, we've been looking at these areas and speaking with different individuals in industry to see what the opportunities could be. So what are we comparing against? The current technologies, the ice roads, and current fixed wing aircraft. And as we know, those are not cheap, and the seasons are shorter for the ice roads. So the airships are really presenting themselves to be a viable technology or a future technology. So an example of what an airship looks like in terms of size and capacity and capability. In North America, helium is the only lifting gas that's been certified. However, in Europe, EASA, they're now certifying hydrogen with conditions. What we're seeing on propulsion systems is a move towards distributed power, where you've got electric motors that are driven by generators. So you have generators that are driving electric motors that are driving propellers. And the benefit of that configuration is that you can turn the propeller at whatever speed you need to. as opposed to a gas turbine where the speed of the fan or the prop on a gas turbine is essentially driven by the core. And in terms of capability, I think we're seeing up to about 60 tons of cargo. Okay. Okay, so to be seen as a viable technology, there's a number of hurdles that need to be overcome, and certification is certainly a big one. In Canada, Airworthiness Chapter 541, the FAA in the US, and EASA in Europe. I mentioned earlier that lifting gas in North America is helium, and helium, as you know, is in short supply and is not cheap. Hydrogen is much more readily available, but there's a lot of issues with hydrogen and its flammability. I think the good news is that there's a lot of development that's going on in commercial aviation, in fixed wing aircraft, in terms of technology development to make hydrogen a safer fuel. And so if we can make it work for fixed wing aircraft, I'm sure we can make it work for airships, even though the use would be different. I mean, fundamentally, you're using it as a lifting gas as opposed to propulsion. And then, of course, the appropriateness of the technology for cold weather applications. You know, testing and certification is required. So desirability, why do we want this technology? It fits very well with this need for decarbonization. And this was a technology that was around in the early 20th century, but it was very much overshadowed by fixed wing aircraft. So aircraft flew faster, and they could get you to where you were going quicker. And based on the metrics in play at that time, the fixed wing aircraft won out. But now we have new metrics to think about. We have new values and we have new limitations. And I think this technology is once again viable. And, you know, so it's definitely been demonstrated that it's a lower cost option for cargo transport. Why is hydrogen not acceptable lifting gas for airships? Here's some quotes. There's some, yeah. So there in aviation and power generation, advances are being made. In fact, we're working with some industrial partners now to develop facilities for testing with hydrogen. There are some limitations, and there's a lot of safety features that need to be employed to make it safe, but it's entirely doable. And as I said, EASA has already certified or allowed for the use of hydrogen as a lift gas with certain conditions. Okay, cold weather considerations, new forms of propulsion. So I talked about distributed power. And if you're using distributed power, you're using electric motors, and electric motors behave differently at altitude and they behave differently in cold temperatures. There's the ground infrastructure that Ross talked about. One of the things that we learned very quickly when we were building the facility for Glacier in Thompson is that the cold weather has different impacts on how things work, and you really need to understand that, and you really need to design for those cold temperatures. So typically we're good for designing up to -20 and -40, but in Thompson that's not cold enough. We need to take it even lower. Technologies for snow and ice clearance, preheating. Actually, cold soak engines is something that happens or is tested up in Thompson. De-icing, heating for fuel systems, and prevention of ice buildup in flight. Talked a little bit about propulsion already, but with the new forms of propulsion, the distributed power, using generators and electric motors, there's new challenges that will be faced in terms of how they operate at altitude. And there'll be new challenges for ground-based testing. Now, the good news is that a lot of this is being developed and moved forward by the aviation industry. And the hope would be that airships would be able to benefit from that technology as it's being developed. Something that Thompson has available is some open pit mines that could be used for the development of places to store the airships, to keep them out of the elements, to create hangars. So this is something that we've been talking about with a number of individuals in the task force. And then finally, my conclusion is, to talk about a cold weather test center is really the tail wagging the dog, in that in order for such a facility to be viable, we really need to have an industry to support. So to get to a place where we can talk about building cold weather test facilities, we need that airship industry to exist, and it's starting. There's partners that are in Canada that are making very, very, very big moves, and if we look at Quebec, we'll see that Flying Whales is there. And the technology has to make sense for the stakeholders, for the northern communities, for mining, and for resources. And I feel like if the communities are interested, then industry will step up, and if industry steps up, then the government will step up to support. So we have to make sure that we have a demand. We have to make sure that we have safe technology, and we have to make sure that we have economic benefit. All right, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. That was interesting, and indeed, one of the comments you made about electric motors operating differently. I don't have much familiarity with that. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how they might operate at colder temperatures that are different?
Thanks, Barry. That's a great question. I don't understand the technology myself. There's a lot of people at MDS that do, but they tell me that there's a phenomenon. I think it's called. I can't. But there, because of the altitude, there is a different way that these electric motors operate, and that does have an impact on their design. So there's so much testing that's going on around the world right now in terms of electric motors, in environmental chambers where they can test at altitude conditions. And the great thing about
Sorry, just going to say, yes, I've seen a number of small demonstration projects with electric airplanes already. So that process is well underway.
Yeah, for sure. And we look at Airbus. Airbus is very much pushing this technology in Europe. Yeah, and so the nice thing about electric motors and testing electric motors in environmental chambers is that unlike a gas turbine, you don't have to have air flowing through it. So you can create a smaller chamber and bring that to altitude conditions without having to worry about continuously treating the air.
The comment about the need for the industry, and I think in northern Canada, we certainly have an opportunity to test out airships during the summer months. And we can certainly operate in the summer months and a lot of benefit. If we could get 6 months of operation, that would make a huge change in itself. But of course, we're going to want to run them all year round, especially once we get started. There'll be a desire for that. So one of the issues, as you mentioned, just like the jet engines, where do you test something as large as an airship? You have to have some protected space, especially if it's an experimental craft. It's not certified. You don't know if everything's going to work. Nobody wants to bring their expensive machine up to the north and hope. So there is a need for a location somewhere, and Thompson is certainly one that's well located. Although I've heard that people have talked about Yellowknife and Fairbanks and other places that could be possible centers. But I think we certainly have an advantage if we have a space where the airship could be protected from. Essentially, it's the side gusts you have to protect from, just so as long as it's under the walls.
Yes, if you're moored, then you absolutely have to have some form of protection. And I did have that one slide that showed some of the open pit mining that is definitely an opportunity for us to explore. And I don't know if you've ever visited. There's a facility in Germany. There's a hangar that was built for these airships, and it was later converted to like a play park, a theme park, because there was so little use for it. So these hangars are going to be quite cost prohibitive. And if you can repurpose something like an open pit mine to be able to store or to shelter an airship, then it's absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, and something that Thompson has on offer potentially, if we can figure out a way to make that work, because you've got you know, some of that structure already presented for you.
And as you mentioned about the summer operations of the jet engine testing, the airship cold weather testing facility could be used for maintenance and operations in the summertime
Yeah.
too. So it could also have a year-round purpose. You know, the concept of hangars, they are expensive, obviously, because they have to be very big buildings. But what we can see is that the ones that were built 100 years ago are still operational. So they have a very long life, and you don't need
Yes.
that many because an airship only goes in and out of a hangar maybe 14 days a year. It's really for inspections or some maintenance that's very heavy. So a single large hangar could probably support 20 or 25 airships as well. So the actual cost, although it is a large capital cost to begin with, the operating costs and maintenance of a facility like that is not maybe as great as it might appear at the surface.
Now, in terms of cold weather testing, of course, there's going to be tests that require that you have the entire airship as an assembly. Now, will you have to do a lot of ground testing with that? I'm not sure. I think by that point you'll probably be doing flight tests, and then all of the subsystems. I can imagine that you can do ground testing on all of these subsystems in a way that you don't require that hangar. So the propulsion system, for example, you could easily ground test that outside, right? Because you've got the cold conditions, you've got the environmental conditions, or you strap it to the belly of an aircraft, a fixed wing aircraft, and you test it that way. So I think there's many ways that we can further the technology and demonstrate compliance with certification requirements before we are in a position where we need to have the capability to actually store an entire airship in a hangar.
I remember talking with the gentleman from Zeppelin about this very point and about testing things in pieces and so on and so forth. Oh, he said absolutely you can do that and you should do that, but he said you need to get the whole airship together to find out that the rubber sticks to the door and you're trying to get it open. So the cold soaking and so on, that the whole system has to be tested. So and again, there's no rules written that I am aware of for what really is required, but that's part of the development of the future.
Yeah, the certification isn't there yet.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but maybe I'm not looking in the right spot. Are there any questions other people would have? Well, certainly Thompson has a couple of advantages. In addition to being maybe the home for cold weather testing, it's really well located as a base to start operations from. So it could do that, and I'm sure that the all the systems have to be tested in addition to landing and takeoff. So the BARD would have to be tested there as well, both for cold weather, but also for the airship using it. So, the notion of having a facility where we could attract every airship from around the world to come and test themselves would be a great advantage, certainly because, for example, you're be pretty hard to cold weather test airships in Brazil.
Yeah.
That's one example. So around the world, even in Europe, I don't think they'd have many places where they get to those temperatures.
Yeah. And kudos to the airship companies that are coming to Canada, that are making waves in Canada and starting the development of this technology here. So, yeah. And Thompson, in terms of environment and in terms of capability as well, there's a lot of knowledge up in Thompson in terms of cold weather test, which we can leverage for for these airships. Yeah. So
Wonderful. Well, I see our next session is going to start very soon, and Derek Brewin, who is going to be chairing that session. Derek, we do have some dynamic adjustment. Carlo of Dade, who's ducking out of a meeting in Ottawa to be able to be with us after just returning from China. So I hope he's not too jet lagged. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I know a difficult trip coming back from overseas is always hard. So we appreciate very much you making the effort to be with us today. And I'll turn the session over to Derek. And you can get started, Derek.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thank you to Barry for setting up yet another wonderful discussion of our supply chains here in Canada. And thank you to Carlo for coming. Carlo Dade is the Director of Trade and Trade Infrastructure for Canada West Foundation. He has a long history of international public policy, including as a professional affiliate at the Johnson Shoyoma School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan, and as a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Washington, D.C., and is a member of the Mexican Council of Foreign Relations. Given that he's got short time, I'll stop there, but the rest of his long experience is in the speaker notes. Carlo, you want to take it away?
Sure. Actually, I got a little bit of time, and I really did want to hear ADM Dick, who I see is on and now looking panicked that he's going to be asked to jump in. But hey, at the ADM level, you're prepared to dance on your feet and well trained. So if I could go after Robert Dick, that would actually be better. It would help to inform my presentation, and I don't want to talk over to talk past what Robert says, and he's an ADM, so he should go first.
I'm used to going last.
I
I appreciate the honorific position. Maybe it's just my golf game that usually sees me last as well and has me trained. But sure, I'll let me see.
I'll let you get your slides ready and I'll introduce you, Robert. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's just fine. I confess I've never used Zoom to do a presentation before, so we'll see what happens here.
Okay, I'll ask the host to make your slides available. And so Robert, I think this is a relatively new position. He's head of the Canada's National Supply Chain Office. That office collaborates with other orders of government, industry and labor to strengthen the efficiency and resiliency of transportation, logistics, infrastructure, and operations, to improve the reliability of Canada's supply chains and to contribute to productivity and affordability. And prior to this current role, he was Assistant Deputy Minister of Transportation Canada's Pacific region and was responsible for the safety and security oversight of federally regulated air, marine, and rail modes of transportation, as well as the transportation of dangerous goods, and the operation of airports owned by Transportation Canada, and the delivery of environmental programs. And under Robert's leadership, the Pacific region built a successful collaboration mechanism with industry and other levels of government that transformed how supply chain disruptions were managed in the critical Western Canadian gateway corridor. With that, I will ask Robert to take over if that's okay.
Sounds good. Can I just ask if the presentation's on the screen for folks?
Yeah, well, it's not at the shared level yet. We can see your slides, but if you hit that little button that shares unless you need your notes.
Like we're still seeing your PowerPoint window as opposed to the presentation view.
Okay.
You might have to duplicate screen if you're using two.
Share. Let's try this. Is that doing it?
Now we're seeing your notes. So I think maybe if you switch the...
Okay, I have just exceeded my technical ability. If there's somebody else who wants to share this, I think the team has it. I apologize. We use Teams, and I'm unfamiliar with the Zoom
Give me 1
construct.
second, share it, and you just tell me when to advance the slides. Give me 1 second.
Sure, maybe I'll just begin. I mean, thanks, Derek. Carlo, you and I should follow up. I don't want to talk past your airplane. You're lucky to catch one. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks, Barry, for the invitation and for setting this up. It's been just over a year since the announcement of the creation of the of the office. And over the past 12 months, we've been really busy, apart from getting staff and getting organized, and doing everything that one has to do to stand up a new organization. We've been out engaging with operators, with investors, with supply chain users, all across the supply chain, all across the country, to build up a clearer picture of our supply chains, how they work. We know why they matter so much, but we do want to hear directly from people on the challenges that they face. I'm going to walk through our view on the strategic landscape, a bit about the office, our work plan, what we're hearing, what we've done so far, and I'll touch on what's coming up. I look forward to the discussion, including around disruptions. And I fully expect to hear about from you what we've been hearing from others about how this is a material impact on current business, but also our reputation and the ability to attract future business for companies, for firms, for farmers, for our country. I think, and if you could go to the next slide, please, I'll just quickly share our origin story. The office was established in December of 2023 in a response to a recommendation made by the National Supply Chain Task Force, with a very, very broad mandate to work with the private and public sector partners to drive coordinated actions to increase supply chain efficiency, reliability, fluidity, and resilience for all modes of transport, all types of goods, for the purposes of trade as well as domestic security. So our remit covers everything that moves within the country or in and out of the country, with an aim to make it more, just to strengthen those supply chains. In terms of the next slide, if you wouldn't mind going there, thanks. Just a little bit of how we're organized. I think folks on this call will have different degrees of insight into how different government departments are structured, but fair to say that government has not traditionally been organized to take an end-to-end view of complex supply chains. Departments and governments are typically organized around a commodity sector or an economic sector, and these silos have meant that we haven't developed a good understanding of the end-to-end operations of the multimodal transportation and logistics system, including and perhaps especially the commercial terms, the business dynamics, the market forces that drive choices by shippers within those. Government, though, is not the only one who's typically taken a bit of a siloed approach either. Operators are organized by commodity, by region, or by mode of transport themselves. So we are trying to look at this holistically, and so you'll see a little bit of how we are organized with both a geographic element, because there is a geographic determinism to the interconnected operations, the multimodal interfaces, the shared infrastructure, the shared climate, the shared geography, geopolitics, market force, market dynamics, all of the rest. But there's also an organizational layer that we've applied in terms of how business works and how goods tend to move. So through international and domestic intermodal, of keen interest to this crowd is that box, but also the bulk imports and exports. We also look at international air cargo and parcels and long-haul trucking. And of course, we have to do a whole bunch of work within the intergovernmental and within the Ottawa system of government. And so I
think so. Do you want me to check?
Across the top.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm hearing somebody else.
Right.
Hi. Thank you for
David,
taking
can
the
you
time. I
unmute?
really appreciate that.
We can go to the next slide while somebody works on muting. A big part of our focus is on deepening our understanding of supply chains through engagement. And I just wanted to give, a little bit of an aperçu of what, after 60 engagement sessions across the country, 2 national supply chain forums, we're hearing at. This is kind of a high-level distillation, but I hope will be familiar to folks. I mean, in terms of the challenges of the North, it is really much one of a lack of infrastructure, a lack of resilience, We experienced the wildfires and the impact of severed supply chains in terms of rail and road connectivity to Yellowknife, which serves as an air hub to the north. There are climate impacts to the Mackenzie River that are presenting energy security challenges for communities in the Nuvie Alouette settlement region. There are ongoing basic connectivity issues. Yet on the other side, vast economic potential, a deep need for resilience, and an intersection with sovereignty and national security in the north. In the east, we actually have a whole bunch of assets in both the seaway, rail, and port infrastructure that is operating well under capacity of what is possible. It has the potential better to serve emerging market opportunities in Europe, Africa, and South America, as well as provide transshipment opportunities into the United States. But it is a story of underutilized assets. Conversely, in the West, we are straining our capacity in terms of port, rail, and light industrial land. It is a region that is susceptible to significant geotechnical and natural hazard and climate risks, and it currently accounts for the vast majority of our natural resource exports, as well as intermodal exports in terms of non-US destined trade. And then, of course, you have the central region in the largest value trade moves generally by truck and some rail into the United States, and in some cases onward to Mexico across the border. We have the largest, most significant piece of net new infrastructure being built in Canada, coming on stream soon in the form of the Gordie Howe Bridge that will add much needed resilience and capacity to that particular corridor. Moving on to the next slide, just wanted to give you a sense of, even as we were, going through the process of staffing and creating an organization, we have tried to hit the ground running and be busy. We've established a strong network of partners in Canada and the United States. We've been working, including with partners across Transport Canada and other departments, to identify and provinces and territories to identify pinch points in Canada's supply chains, which in turn can serve as focal points for optimizational initiatives. In the east, the department's supporting projects that support more efficient and sustainable vessel transit plans matched to berth availability. In the west, we're exploring ways to optimize the Lower Mainland rail corridor and examining how short sea shipping could improve fluidity and resilience in the region. We've done a lot of work on mapping supply chains and focused on, of interest to this crowd, grain in the rain. We have an initiative there working alongside industry and labor representatives from the grain companies and at the Port of Vancouver to develop innovative solutions for loading grain at terminals during the predictably inclement weather that occurs around Vancouver this time of year. And in that context, we've developed multiple prototypes of equipment, and we're testing these approaches on ships right now in the Port of Vancouver. If these are optimized, it could have a significant improvement in the predictable loading of grain, which has follow-on benefits for the entire fluidity of the rail network in the Lower Mainland across commodities. We have unfortunately been given multiple opportunities to test our mechanisms for injecting more transparency, predictability, and therefore faster recovery from disruptions as a result of the too many disruptions that we've had this year. On the following slide, supply chains really have been gaining attention ever since the pandemic, to the point that they've become the subject of daily conversation. And just as a general proposition, I tend to say that when people are talking about the plumbing, it usually means something's amiss. We'd like to go back in some ways to a point where it can be taken for granted, but without actually taking it for granted, by being able to ensure that we're bringing the sustained attention to improving it for the reliability of Canadians and small businesses and Canadians here, but also to be a reliable trading partner abroad. Everybody relies on these supply chains, and the stakes for Canada, given the vast distances over which we move stuff and the portion of landed costs that are accounted for by transportation and logistics, means that we need to do this even better than others, more efficiently than others, and in doing so contribute to Canada's productivity challenges. Just moving on to slide 8, thank you. We need to export and import goods for our economy and our communities, but Canada is also a trading nation, and our trading partners rely on us to provide goods and production capacity in a global network of value chains. Our industries are tapping into global supply chains to be competitive, and about 58% of Canada's imports are used as inputs into production, an added value service that boosts our GDP and contributes to our wealth. Meanwhile, Canada is an exporter of goods that the world can't live without, and certainly grains and fertilizers will be of particular interest to those on this webinar today. Our supply chains affect the food security of other countries, going beyond commercial interests, and certainly when the Trade Commissioner services, when our embassies abroad are engaging in times of disruption, that is the message that they are hearing from foreign governments. In addition to trade, many goods move domestically within our country as well, including to communities in the north. None of this would be possible without well-functioning supply chains. On slide 9, since COVID, our supply chains have had to contend with back-to-back disruptions, and these recent examples have shown just how fragile those supply chains can be. A ship stuck in the Suez Canal can slow down Canada's entire construction industry. A strike or lockout can bring Canada's economy to a halt, and disruptions just generally raise the cost of living for the average Canadian. They hurt businesses, and they harm our reputation as an international trading partner. And for those who might have been listening to CBC this morning, I mean, the impact of things like the Canada Post disruption that's occurring right now are felt by Canadians all across the country, and by small businesses and larger businesses as well across the country. So it matters. It matters. We can't stop. Disruptions are inevitable. Some might be more avoidable than others. We can build resilience in different ways, but there will always be disruptions. We have to minimize them. We have to build up our capacity to recover as quickly as possible. And so on slide 10, just a note, taking a look at the world, it's not a question of if, unfortunately, but rather when there'll be future shocks, whether domestically or internationally, that will affect Canada. We see conflict is shaking up established trade routes, different tariff structures, trade agreements, shift the movement of goods in and out of Canada, in and out patterns within North America and to North America. Geopolitical tensions have added sanctions and tariffs and shifted relationships in a multitude of ways, and will continue to do so. Obviously, people on this call will be attuned to the challenges posed by potential Chinese anti-dumping duties on canola, which affects both price and sale in canola, one of the largest markets, or sees diversion via third countries, entailing additional cost and complexity. These sorts of potential shocks of risks to our supply chain operations necessitate a new forward-looking approach and leadership that will bring parties together to mitigate the impacts of shocks and, as I said earlier, to facilitate faster recovery. Which brings me to slide 11 and the proposed national transportation supply chain Strategy, we have heard the need for a common overarching vision for Canada's supply chains. And the office has been working on a strategy that I know the government aims to release in the coming months once finalized. And I just want to share in broad strokes here the areas that it will cover. And the drivers behind the strategy are similar to those driving most of the office works. We're a complex trading landscape. We're a trading nation in a complex global landscape with shifting trading patterns. We're a small open economy dependent on trade. We are a market taker in many key respects. There's an imperative to keep up with technology in this space to preserve market access and opportunities, but also to drive efficiency and optimization and planning. There's an opportunity to go further there as well to drive productivity. There are many opportunities to make supply chains more efficient and reliable, including by improving fluidity at the border. There's a need to solve corridor-specific supply chain challenges, including capacity. So considering the state of play, the strategy puts forward a vision for strengthening efficiency, fluidity, and resilience, focused on the 4 action areas that are on slide 13. If we could switch over to that. It's really about providing a framework for collaboration towards this vision based on federal leadership, collaboration, information sharing around these 4 interconnected action areas. Enhancing capacity and resiliency in transportation, bolstering supply chain visibility and driving investments in the digital, modernizing legislative and regulatory frameworks, and supporting fluidity across internal and international borders. It is a strategy that is designed to be flexible and evergreen to withstand the crisis of the moment. And when this office was launched, it was rooted in a time when everybody's frame of reference was the shortages of COVID and affordability and inflationary pressures. I think, if we were created today, the language would be much more around the geopolitics, geopolitical security issues, tariffs, cross-border dynamics. We can't predict what all future shocks will be. We're in an uncertain environment. We need to focus on the characteristics of a supply chain, and that's what these areas aim to do, is to get us a supply chain that can withstand different types of shocks and unpredictable environment, and in so doing, position Canada for long-term success by allowing people to rally around a common vision. I promise I'm coming to a conclusion so we can go over to Carlo, but just quickly on the next slide in terms of what's next from us. We will be focusing on the coming months on continued collaboration with partners and other stakeholders, advancing key activities, finalizing things like the Grain in the Rain, and moving that from scale model and testing into real world application for next fall and the grains the 2025 grain season. We'll continue to support colleagues across government on implementing what came out of the supply chain and border regulatory review. We will continue to drive optimization of existing infrastructure while planning for the longer term. And we look forward to the release of the National Supply Chain Strategy. And I will pause or stop there, Derek, and let you hand it over to whoever's next.
Well, will you take one question just as you've seen all the slides?
Sure.
So there is a question from Adam, I think, who's asking about the cost of improving the system, and I think the other sort of behind that question is, what do you think is the key strategic investment of what you just listed there? Is there some cost in mind that you think you really have to tackle to meet that strategy?
It's multiple facets, right? I mean, driving the digital will entail costs, not just to government potentially, but we need to see more investment. Canada lags in investment in digitalization. We lag the G7 We lag in productivity, we lag in investment in ICT in the G7, and the worst performing, most laggardly sector of all is transportation, logistics, and warehousing. So changing that requires an investment by government, but also by industry. We need to look at what are the barriers and the impediments that have prevented that from occurring, and they're multiple. There's also capacity, right? And colleagues are working right now actually with provinces and territories to identify what is the infrastructure investment that is needed to position Canada to deliver on critical minerals, on clean energy growth, on other trade and investment priorities, and improving the resilience of our supply chain across the country. And then there's a question of how best to attract private sector capital into those types of investment as well, so that it's not just relying on the public purse. And I think, you know, the type of work that's been done actually around things like the from shovel ready to shovel worthy report, you know, lay a strong foundation for that type of analysis that's going on. So I'm not going to throw out some number, but driving digital and driving capacity with multiple levers, not just spending by government, are I think the work that has to be done.
Yeah, I'll put in a plug for one good regulation that really led to investment. The shift in the MRE. I know the MRE is not Barry's most favorite regulatory tool, but when they shifted it in 2018 to allow investments, we saw a huge ramp up in the number of grain efficient cars and the investment of the grain companies in the Vancouver port. I just wanted to flag that you can do it without using government money. That's just a relatively small, sweet tweak in a regulatory framework.
Yeah, and my understanding is, you know, I think CPKC, if I'm not mistaken, has almost completely transitioned to more high efficiency grain cars, seeing not quite as far down the road, but also a larger fleet. But you know, that is happening, and it translates into gains across the supply chain.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry, folks, we'll get to other questions after we get Mr. Dade started. Carlo, I'll let you start as soon as you got access to the slides.
Well, no slides.
Okay, that's a little bit fast then.
And a little less entertaining. Well, thanks, Derek, and thanks, Barry. It's always a pleasure working with the University of Manitoba, and certainly with your institute. It's always fascinating to hear about airships too. Robert, thanks for letting me go ahead, or thanks for going ahead. So my comments today, and again, apologies for the lack of slides, but as Barry mentioned, I've been on airplanes for 20 out of the last 36 hours or something like that. It would seem to be a good time to do slides, but trust me, it's the last thing you want to do crammed in coach. But the talk today, or my comments today, more than talk, will be on the international dimensions of our trade competitiveness tied to infrastructure. We know the stats and figures for the importance of trade in Canada. Robert mentioned some. We rely on the movement of goods, people, money, and ideas in and out of the country for 2 out of every $3 we earn in Canada. That is roughly 3 times the amount for the Americans and half again as much as Australia. So we hear these numbers and they go by, but the international context really drives home how important moving goods are for Canadians. And given that the majority of the population work in the service sector, retail, doctors, lawyers, teachers, university professors, government officials, healthcare, the trade numbers really aren't on everyone's mind or on the minds of the majority of the population. So that's one point as to why we always go back over those numbers. But the context in which we tend to discuss our trade infrastructure and the importance of being able to move goods is done largely in a domestic context. How are we doing in Canada? If you're talking to farmers, it's about issues moving crops. If you're talking about large-scale commodity producers, potash, mining, forestry, it's about competing with other goods on the rail line to move goods. And then, of course, there are the work stoppages that also harm our global reputation. But these issues translate or are seen outside of Canada in a couple of different lenses, one of which we're aware of and one which I don't think we fully grasp, and that's critical to understand to shape the importance of what we do in Canada, the importance of the problem, and how we resolve it. But first, on the issues within Canada, Robert mentioned our report done with the participation of our good friend Chris Lawrence and Manitoba Heavy Construction, along with the Business Council of Canada, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and other leading business organizations across the country. And that is from shovel ready to shovel worthy. So the first point to make before jumping into the international context is that part of the problem of Canada's trade infrastructure and the negative impact the problems we have in Canada have on our ability to export goods, to earn those 2 out of every $3 we do through trade, is not just the issues themselves, not just the labor rail strikes, not just troubles at the port, not just delays in moving goods. It's the perception that we do not have a handle on the problem, that we continue to kick the can down the road with short-term political solutions that solve the political problem, but not the underlying structural issues. Hence the title of our report, From Shovel Ready, those projects that the government puts out in economic crises, or the usual task taken by provincial and federal governments of seeking to solve an immediate problem. What's the current blockage in the system? What's the current issue with moving rail? Which group in Canada is where is the current environmental disaster or problem? And let's solve that. Doing that without an understanding of how investments to solve short-term problems impacts the overall system, how it impacts all users to the system in our integrated national supply and production chains that are used by farmers, that are used by miners, that are used by forestry, that are used by manufacturers, that are used to move potash, etc., is a recipe for continued dysfunction in the system and continued problems and continued damage to our international reputation. So the damage to our reputation isn't just the individual issues, it's the perception that we do not have a handle on the situation. And to add to that, the conversation that we have about this in Canada tends to focus, well, on Canada. What are we doing? What excuses do we have for not being able to solve these issues? What are the political impediments that we have to solving these issues? Those aren't considerations taken by our customers. Again, the folks who pay for 2 out of every $3 that we earn as a nation. There's less interest in how the internal problems that Canada has, and the interest is on how do you compare to other jurisdictions from which I can buy similar products. As you move up the value chain in international sales, you move to customers with higher incomes. Those customers tend to be more choosy, and they tend to buy not just on price, but also on quality. We're all aware of that, but also on reliability. So the issue we hear at Canada West when we travel to these markets and have frank conversations with business and other academics and think tanks is that Canada falls woefully short in these regards. there are concerns about our ability to deliver goods and our ability to meet the demands of markets, not just for quality, but also for reliable delivery. And again, that concern is expressed in the context of other jurisdictions that are making significant investments. Infrastructure Australia. The Australians have, for over a decade, have had a handle on their integrated supply and production systems. Some of the things that Robert Dick talked about that Canada is trying to do, other jurisdictions have been doing for decades, and we're trying to catch up. In this regard, too, we've seen the massive infrastructure investments in the US, and we haven't seen a concomitant response in Canada. So not just internationally, but within the North American context, we are falling behind, not just in spending, but in the ability to spend intelligently, to fund shovel-worthy and not just shovel-ready or fund to solve immediate problems. I just returned from China, and what is fascinating about China is the development of economic corridors within the country and outside of the country. So one of our largest customers for most of what Western Canada produces is looking at us very askance in terms of our ability to manage our infrastructure system and to be able to deliver goods. The last point I'll make is in terms of international competition and others who produce what we produce in terms of commodities and goods to sell to the global market, we've seen significant investments in infrastructure throughout the producers and consumers of the goods that we produce by China. And here I'm referring to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, everyone on the webinar will have a different interpretation of what the Belt and Road Initiative means, and about 10% of those will probably land close to the mark. But the Belt and Road Initiative is several things, several different initiatives by China. But one of those initiatives is to fund 5 production and supply chains, economic corridors tied to China to move goods in and out of China. This includes moving goods in and out of jurisdictions that produce and sell what we produce. So in the future, and actually now, we're starting to see these investments come online. So the competitive situation for Canada is no longer competing against a Brazil that's trying to fund its own infrastructure, but a Brazil that is receiving investments from China, not directly part of the Belt and Road, but for all intents and purposes, Brazil isn't part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but for all intents and purposes, the reality is that it's receiving money and it's functioning as a part of the Belt and Road, but they're receiving investments that will enable them to move massive quantities of goods, oil seeds, for example, to the Pacific Ocean and onward to Asia. China's goal in this is not just to increase supplies that flow to China, but to increase the availability of food and other commodities on world markets so that prices remain stable and that China has greater food security, not because it has access directly to Brazil, but because the supply in global markets is elevated, and that enhances their food security. So the end point here is that we need to look beyond, look past our noses when thinking about this issue. The competitive landscape, not just in producing what we produce, has grown more intense, but the competitive landscape in being able to move goods has changed on the micro scale with investments like Infrastructure Australia and the development of systems, institutions to manage the movement of goods, and also the Belt and Road Initiative and what China is doing to bring supplies of what we produce in Canada online and to increase the fluidity of the movement of those goods. So I'll stop there with those comments. Again, if you haven't read Shovel Ready to Shovel Worthy, I would urge that you take a look at it. It's a bit dated, 7 years old, but it does make the point that we cannot solve the individual issues that agriculture faces, that farmers face, or that forestry faces, unless we first solve the systemic issue. And I'll note that on the prairies, we are actually doing this. So the prairie provinces have signed a memorandum of understanding where they are sharing information on locations of production of goods, assets that move the goods, and we are now able on the prairies to make, for the first time in Canada, informed decisions about investments based on a comprehensive understanding of the movement of all goods or all key goods through the integrated supply and production systems across the prairies. We hope that's a model that the feds pick up, and that we can expand this nationally. But at least for now, the prairie provinces certainly have taken leadership in doing the actual work of producing systems and sharing information to finally make informed, intelligent, system-wide decisions in Canada.
Thank you, Carlo. There is a question here on there was a question that's sort of for Robert about supply chains and airships that I will let him maybe address later. But for you, there was a question about concrete examples of how our infrastructure has already caused issues. One thing I wanted to flag when Robert was putting up the long line of things that were shocking our system was how well we did respond through COVID and the BC floods especially. I thought that when those lines shut down that we had, you know, a monstrous event happening and we responded fairly well. When you say that we're being considered to be underinvesting, where's the big problem?
So the problems, you can find the bridge in the lower mainland in British Columbia going to the port is an example of difficulties. The problems we had with pipelines in expanding the recent twinning, though we did get it done, it was a high cost and a delay in time. But I would, again, take the lens back. We're not talking about individual issues, the whack-a-mole approach to this. We're instead looking at the systemic response or the system-wide response. You can get lucky or you can be successful in putting out the individual fires, but if the perception internationally is that you're constantly going to be putting out fires and constantly responding because you don't have a comprehensive view of the system and an ability to make investments based on longer term prognosis rather than just responding to the flood, are you making investments that will also mitigate future damage? Are you taking advantage of the rebuild after the flood to fund in ways that make improvements on the existing system? So it's that worry that we see internationally. And comparatively, we know that other jurisdictions have this ability and do this. So if you're taking a long-term bet on Canada as a supplier, do you want a country that can continue to put out fires as your main supplier, or do you want a country, an economy, a producer that has the ability to prevent fires from happening?
Okay, to some extent, Robert's supply chain initiative is sort of a beginning of that, but we're talking about a country that's got fairly large deficits. How do we get industry to invest in those big investments?
So for industry, the key point is if you have a system of national planning like the Australians do, and you have the ability to make informed decisions, you also have the ability to construct longer term, I hate to use the word, but pipelines of projects. You have a high degree of certainty of what will get built, where, when it will get built, and how it fits in with other users of the system. So that makes investment more attractive because of certainty of the investment, the returns on investment, you thought through all the other users, and you thought of the potential impacts and ramifications. So that in other jurisdictions has tended to attract investment because of the system, the certainty. You still have the issue of political interference. I hate to use the word interference, but politics coming into play. But the long-term plan, the data that goes into the plan and the work that's done for it can tend to mitigate not eliminate, but mitigate last minute political decisions and interference. And that again increases the willingness of the private sector to become involved. There's a certain degree of certainty or predictability about this.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'm going to invite our next speaker to kind of start to get ready. Jill, I will introduce you. Jill Verwey is the president of the Keystone Agricultural Producers, CAP around here, not the CAP that comes with strings attached money that the federal government has, but the Keystone Agriculture Producers. Jill is married to Raymond, and they farm in Portage La Prairie on their 4th generation family farm. Verwey Farms Limited is a mixed farm, including 8,000 acres of grain and oilseeds and a dairy operation. Jill's responsible for the financial and environmental planning of the farm, and is in addition overseeing the management of each of those different farm operations. She was elected as president of CAP in 2023, and she previously served as the vice president from 2018 to 2023. And then prior to that, she was an active member in her District 6. She's also encouraging her children to get involved in CAP. And she's a member of a bunch of local boards and the Portage La Prairie Curling Club and Dairy Farmers of Manitoba and many other things. And she's also a grad from our School of Agriculture diploma program. And with that, I'll let you read the rest of her bio in the lines. Jill, are you ready to go? Yes, here.
I am ready to go.
Great, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you.
Great, and thank you for having me here today. And as you mentioned, I'm currently president of Keystone Agricultural Producers. And first, I'd like to thank Barry for including us in today's event. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to share the stage with the quality of speakers here today. We're always happy to come out and speak about agriculture and to bring the on-farm perspective into important discussions like Fields on Wheels event. In my remarks, I want to highlight some of the big irritants facing Manitoba farmers, how trade is a value as an exporting industry, and opening up a broader discussion on what disruptions in our critical supply chains means not only to farmers, but for Canada and our economy at whole. First, I guess Keystone Agriculture Producers, I'll kind of give you an overview on our association known as CAP, Manitoba's General Farm Organization, founded in 1984 and recently celebrated our 40th anniversary. At CAP, we focused on the prosperous future of all Manitoba farmers and to have a unified voice across all sectors. We deliver results for our members through our advocacy work, which includes meeting with government officials on policy and regulatory change. And CAP is a grassroots organization, and our policy is developed through engagement with our farmer members. CAP has currently approximately 5,000 direct paying individual members, as well as 20 commodity associations that are group members for the association, with a mandate to represent a shared interest of all sectors in agriculture in the province. As mentioned earlier, my background, I've served as president for the last 2 years and been on the board in various capacities. And our board members are farmers elected by their fellow farmers. We currently on our farming operation is in Portage La Prairie, where I farm with my husband, my children, as well as my husband's 3 brothers and family members on the farm, representing 4 generations. We currently farm approximately 8,000 acres of grain and oilseeds and have a dairy operation. In the past years, we were active beef business for a number of years, as well as grew potatoes. Our farming operation is diverse, and because of this, I've seen issues in farming from a wide variety of perspectives that exist in different subsectors of agriculture. This includes challenges in the Canadian supply chain as it relates to the movement of not only farm goods off the farm, but when it comes to accessing critical inputs and supplies for our farming operation. I guess you know, in the last number of years, including last year, we have to deal with a number of variables that we have no control over. The first one that comes to mind is weather, which of course can result in being one of not the largest deterrent on value of our crop each year. But the other one, however, we struggle with extensively in the past year is reliability in the supply chain and how potentially going to prevent our products from getting to market. And I'm talking about labor disruptions. In early 2024, concerns about the potential double strike with CN and CPKC started to be talked about. This materialized in the summer with a lockout in August taking place, with actions taken by the federal government to mandate the end of the disruption. In September, we saw the West Coast port strike for the second time in just over a year. As a reminder, July of 2023 saw a disruption in the ports in BC, which caused massive losses in the ag industry. October had the Port of Montreal strike, which resulted in again binding arbitration to bring workers back on the job. Last November, we saw a brief strike with CGC employees at the West Coast that lasted less than a day. And finally, earlier this week, there again is another fear of a potential strike involving CN's rail workers in January of 2025. There's been a tentative deal reached pending ratification from their members, but however, the uncertainty is still there until the vote is complete. While the reliability of shipping networks in Canada is not uniquely a concern of agriculture, given the export nature of our industry, we're extremely sensitive to shocks and disruptions in the supply chain. That leads us to extended interswitching, which I wanted to mention. When it comes to the movement of ag goods by rail in Canada, something that is frequently discussed is interswitching. The 2022 National Supply Chain Task Force report recommended extending 30-kilometer interswitching radius limit to be increased, and the federal government in the budget introduced in 2023 amended the Canada Transportation Act to allow for interswitching within 160 kilometers radius for an 18-month pilot project. At that 160-kilometer radius, more than 90% of Western Canadian inland terms are within interswitching limits. Extended interswitching gives shippers who are physically located on a single rail the ability to seek out competing services from the nearest closest railway within a certain distance. This balances negotiations in a way that encourages better service or pricing for the benefit of the entire supply chain. Extended interswitching would benefit producers as it increases competition to drive down prices, improve efficiency, and provide better access to markets. We'll go into trade. Why trade matters. The level of reliance on exports and international trade is dependent both geographically as well as which product a farmer is producing. In 2023, Manitoba exported nearly $9.5 billion in ag food products, which is 38% increase from 2019. This represented 9.5% of all of Canada's agri-food exports in 2023. Our main markets are the US, Japan, and China, with top exported products being wheat, canola, and pork. Agri-food exports represent over 43% of international markets coming out of Manitoba, and we are one of the top industries in the province. On a national stage, 2/3 of Canada's GDP is linked to trade. Before talking about the potential impacts and disruptions of the Canada-US trade, I would like to touch a few points. Simply put, US is Manitoba's #1 agri-trade partner. This relationship goes both ways. There are a number of one buyers of Manitoba canola that have seen a steady increase of exports overall to the US in the recent years. Some of the top exports are wheat, pork, and potatoes. The US also provides Manitoba with 86% of all imported agri-food products. Tariffs tend to get all of the focus in the media, especially recently when it comes to trade disruptions. Some of the biggest trade barriers we face that are causing fear in agriculture, however, they are non-tariff barriers. Many of these non-tariff barriers Our ideologies are motivated with lack of scientific backing or evidence to justify their use. One of those is California's Proposition 12, which includes specific housing requirements for all pork products sold in the state that have effectively exported their domestic requirements to any other pork producer wanting to sell pork in their states. The next one is, the treatment of Canadian cattle carcasses with PAA, which has been a major barrier to access to the EU and United Kingdom marketplaces. Hospitals, healthcare, and pharmaceutical facilities that use this for cleaning and sanitizing traits and processing facilities, they try to, you use this to limit food spoilage and prevent bacterial contamination. Both the United States and Canada have approved applying PAA to animal carcasses if the maximum permitted levels are not exceeded. Despite the presence of the CETA agreement, PAA still presents a barrier for beef exports to Europe, and Canada continues to petition the European Food Safety Authority to reassess its current ban. And I think another one that comes to mind is country of origin labeling, which is something that we've been battling with the US market as well. The US has brought in VCOOL, or voluntary country of origin labeling, which sets very strict standards as to what can be labeled as a product of the US. Under these rules, an animal must be born, raised, slaughtered, and packaged all in the US to have the product of US label. Where this causes a particular challenges is the hog industry, given the quality of weanlings, the quantity rather of weanlings that we ship to the US, which are then raised, slaughtered, and packaged in the US. These changes have negatively affected Manitoba pork producers. GMOs and anti-science opposition to them have continued to cause issues across the globe. Countries that block imports of GMO crops create challenges for Canadian exporters seeking market diversification. Exporters face challenges if non-GMO crops carry trace amounts of a GMO crop. Markets that have anti-GMO policies include France, Germany, Netherlands, Peru, Turkey, to name a few. Maximum residue limits, or MRLs, are another irritant for trade and affect producers. MRLs are the maximum trace amount of a pesticide residue that is allowed in crops for food consumption. By following pesticide labels, farmers ensure that their product meets these national MRLs. Internationally, Codex provides guidance to countries so that countries can follow to ensure trade consistency, but not all countries follow Codex guidelines. Countries can set their own MRLs, which may even be more stringent than Canadian standards. Incompatible and unobtainable MRLs create non-trade barriers, ultimately harming trade flows and farmer income. If agricultural product grown in Canada cannot meet foreign MRLs, then the product does not enter that importer's country. Now we're getting down to about the last couple slides here, and I wanted to touch on trade tariffs and our relationships south of the border. A few weeks ago, President-elect Trump got everyone in Canada's attention with a post on social media calling for a 25% tariff on all Canadian and Mexican goods exported to the US unless certain national security and drug crime-related activities are addressed, which according to Trump are the areas that Canada needs to deal with and relates to impacts in the United States. This announcement caused immediate reaction across industries, given a wide-ranging devastation such as a policy could result in. While the election of Trump has bound to bring with some challenges to our trade relationships, seeing that 25% figure stated by the incoming president, with it being something that he could commit to on the day his presidency, is certainly concerning. If we refer back to the numbers I stated earlier, the obvious impacts would on exports. Manitoba alone exported $4.5 billion in agri-foods goods to the US in 2023. According to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Canada's GDP would shrink 2.6%, or roughly 78 billion Canadian dollars, costing Canadians approximately $1,900 per person annually. US GDP would shrink by 1.6%, or roughly $467 billion, costing Americans $1,300 per person annually. Our work at CAP is focused on working with the Minister of Agriculture provincially and reaching across Canada with our colleagues on a pan-Canadian approach in dealing with these threats. It's imperative that industry and government work as partners in dealing with proposed threat of tariffs and ensuring that we all are delivering a consistent, clear message on the value of Canada-US trade to our friends to the south. Additionally, we must not be afraid as industries to collaborate across industries and not lean into looking for particular tariff carve-outs in sectors. In closing, all of the challenges I've highlighted demonstrate how a country we need to really be focused on addressing the reliability of our supply chain. This is not only for farmers, but for anyone looking to do business in Canada. What is Canada's reputation if we have a strike every few months that could potentially cripple our supply chain and the ability to move goods across the country? Why would foreign investors put capital into the Canadian market if disruptions are not only possible, but likely? We are seeing what happens when our trade relationships are disrupted, whether it's tariffs, other barriers, or challenges, and how that can throw further uncertainty into our businesses. All of the delays and disruptions have resulted and will continue to put pressures on the cost of critical goods to farmers, as well as reduce their ability to generate high prices for goods. It is going to take a national leadership from the government and industry to address some of these challenges. Canada's reputation is on the line. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions for the remaining time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks for that. And given that I think he might leave fairly soon, Carlo, I think you have a question for Jill that might be better if you articulated it to her rather than I read this. Do you see that question, Jill? That's quite a lot of information.
Yeah, that's not. It's not it's not something I was just passing. I should have just directed that to Bill and not to everybody. But yeah, the point. You know, trade and trade infrastructure center just back from China. Extensive discussions globally. Just careful with the non-tariff barriers issue. It's a complicated one and one that we fight all the time at Canada West. But there are different cultural sensitivities around some products, different scientific standards. The one on safety, there is a global division between those who believe you have to prove that a product has a specific harm attached to it, and others that say you have to prove that there is no harm, that there is no possible harm. And that's just a deep philosophical divide that we have globally between the US, Canada, to some degree Japan, and then Europeans and several other countries and other markets. So just to call out that we have to be sensitive to that. And the problem is it points to different solutions. If you're yelling at someone about science and they're not buying the science, you have to find another approach to get them to accept the product. And then of course there are just, you know, an investigation on canola in response to tariffs on EVs is pretty it is pretty clear that that doesn't involve cultural sensitivities or different definitions of safety. That's just what it is.
No, thank you for those comments. Yes.
We were talking about inviting Mike Gifford to this meeting, and he spent most of his career adding tariffs back into the system when they were being applied to our country. So far, we're not in that terrible situation. Jill, I do kind of have a question related to that, just because you're a person who's got income and probably boots in both camp in terms of a dairy producer and a grain producer. You know how important trade is to your grain farm, but it's also something that President Trump has, the supply management is something that President Trump has talked about. Are you willing to talk a little bit about that? Sorry to.
It put me on the spot on that one. I think because our farming operation is like you said, boots in both camps, and I think I'm proud to say that around our table and representing all producers in Manitoba, that I've always stressed upon the fact that all trade is important and has its values, and I think in the effort of trying to not be divisive between the sectors, I think we have to respect each sector's methods for trade, and at the end of the day, provide that one singular voice, as a country and certainly as a province here in Manitoba. So I've always stressed upon that, that we all have we have to respect those trade, because they're all important at the end of the day to providing prosperous Manitoba and prosperous Canada.
Thank you. And I have talked to people further up the supply chain in dairy, and they said, that's not broke, don't fix it. Okay. Sorry, I'm not seeing any specific new questions here yet, am I? I wonder if we could get more detail on the specific policy of interswitching, whether or not it's what is the likelihood of it being sort of used, and our hopes with it as a solution someday.
I think with the recommendation going forward, I think that we've seen that it is working, and that having that extended, I think 100% would be great for the industry. Again, at the end of the day, to create that competitive and have options for industry in choosing when they have the opportunity to do that. I think having that competitive market is very important, both on the value of the crop that producers are shipping, as well as on the competitive side for actually accessing inputs that are transported. So 100% that competitiveness is needed going forward.
Robert, can you comment on that, or are you willing?
Well, to be candid, the interswitching issue is primarily managed by our rail policy group at Transport Canada. It is part of the rail freight review that is underway. It is, as people are no doubt aware, somewhat contentious. On the one hand, there's the arguments that Jill has been advancing. On the other are the assertions that it adds operational complexity, which can affect the fluidity of rail networks. If there's different companies' equipment, there's different safety and other measures operationally that have to be put in place, and it can be hard to find evidence on the issue, because the argument is essentially that if you look at the uptake of the provision, it's low, but what shippers will say is that the existence of the potential to go with a competitor's service places a discipline on price or service in negotiations, but it's very hard to get at quantifiable evidence around that. So that's as far as I can go on this, but just to say that those are sort of the contours of that particular issue. If you'll indulge me while I have the floor, though, Derek, perhaps I could respond to a couple of other things I saw in the chat.
Sure.
One is, why are the prairies gray on the map? Who asked that question? I'd like to tell you it's because I grew up on the shores of Lake Winnipeg, and it matches the gray of but it was probably just like a color palette. I don't know. There's no message there. I'm a proud prairie boy, so don't think it's any slight. You know, picking up on some of Carlo's points, and one that I'm so thrilled that you made, Derek, and that Jill alluded to, that the establishment of the office itself is a signal from the government of Canada to foreign markets that we recognize we need to do better for Canada, for Canadians, as a reliable trading partner. It's the start of a journey. It's not the end point. We have to match action and deed to words and rhetoric and you know, all of that. But it is an important signal. And Jill, I was so glad to hear you say that it's not just national leadership, but it's government and industry as well. It is action, and that's why collaboration was a theme of the task force, and it's a theme of our strategy and the framework we're putting in place. We have a strategic advantage as a fairly small community in Canada that we actually can get together. And we've seen efforts where we sell ourselves and are aligned that have an impact in the past. And I think that's what we need to do here, both to sell what we're doing, but actually to deliver together on strengthening the supply chain. The areas we're looking in, and Carlo mentioned, you know, for instance, the famous Second Narrows rail bridge to the North Shore in Vancouver. And folks on this call will probably know that a large number of grain terminals, Richardson's, Cargill and G3 are located on the North Shore and depend on that rail bridge. It's a 100-year-old lift bridge. We are working, the Port of Vancouver is doing great work, and we're doing other work with them and other partners to more reliably increase the transits from a steady state rail transit of about 19 trains a day. We think it can get up to about 25. That's a good thing. But it's a good example where we need to work to optimize the infrastructure we have. Building new infrastructure is hugely expensive, and in this country, the reality is it takes a lot of time. You can debate why and all that, but it does. And so we'd be nuts not to work really hard to bring on stream stranded capacity within the existing infrastructure. It's the cheapest, it's the fastest to get online. So we're working hard with that. It's a good example. I do take the points, and they're true, about the investment climate overall. How do we attract capital investment? Looking at taxation, permitting, jurisdictional certainty, predictability, all of those factors to which Carlo pointed. I'd just inject a caution around the Australian example. I think it's the sort of thing that we want to expose to good academic and public policy debate for those who aren't as close to it. It's a bit more of a, shall we say, you know, dirigist model. Where, you know, as an example, people within it's like school catchment areas. They said, you know, if you're within, and I'm making this up in terms of numbers, but X distance of this port, you must export through that port. And that port is given a monopoly on that type of export good or commodity good from within that catchment area. That does de-risk as an additional step investment, private sector capital, but it does so with a trade-off in competition, and it puts government in a role of managing and phasing capacity that comes on stream. So those are certainly public policy choices, but I just say they come with trade-offs and deserve an airing.
Fair points all around. Thank you very much. There's a quick note here in the chat that I will mention that we have very low grain rates. I think that was in response to interswitching. That could competition affect that much? It might be more in terms of service than in rates. And I do, as a person who's sort of championed our system and how much grain we've moved over the last 15 years, it's been pretty impressive what's happened since some of the regulatory changes happened. So there are regulatory solutions rather than problems. Do we have any more specific questions? Jill,
Derek, if I could ask a question,
For
a more
sure.
general one, in terms of the lagging productivity and so on. Have we done any benchmarking to really look at how our supply chains are operating? And I hear once in a while, you know, the Vancouver port is at this bottom layer or whatever, and you hear these comments about various components, but how is our supply chain really working? Do we have any notions of fluidity and so on compared to any other country, Robert? I mean, this is one of the things that I know your office is just starting. You may not have had time to do that, but is that something you're looking at?
So we're working with both the bulk and the intermodal sector to figure out what indicators and KPIs we should sort of look at for performance. It's a very, very complex space, as you'll appreciate, even to figure out what we want to measure and to serve what needs. But one of the needs we do identify is telling our story abroad. Companies shipping will have their own sort of benchmark. And one thing that we have done in the intermodal space, our economics group worked on it for years and reports on it periodically. In the intermodal space, for instance, is I think it's the Shanghai to Chicago, Toronto, Montreal cycle time in the intermodal space. And Canada compares quite favorably on that. And shippers are constantly comparing the price, reliability, and the velocity of different routes, right? The speed that they can move stuff. So people here will know that the shortest overall route from China to Chicago is via Prince Rupert. It's very efficient. So we are looking at those things, and we're looking at bulk as well. It's complex. The port performance study to which you allude, I'd encourage the academic community to go to town and kind of the metrics that they use, but I would it factors in things that you just have to be cautious in using that. I will say, one of its measures is the speed with which a vessel can go from the 12 nautical mile limit to berth. So if you do not have the Gulf Islands species at risk, and you don't need pilots, and you can barrel in straight to a port at 25 knots, you will inevitably be higher on that metric than others. It then goes on to measure other facets of government service and pilotage and berthing and terminal and crane efficiency and so on and so forth. It's primarily an intermodal metric, but we're keen to see some metrics that we can use to tell our story around performance, including how fast we recover. And I forget who mentioned it, might have been you, Derek, but I was leading the Pacific region during the atmospheric river and was on the front line of that. And I will say the engineering capacity that the BC Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure and our two Class 1 Canadian railways that they brought to bear to recover. I got to go up when it was in progress and see it. I never would have expected that it was feasible to recover that as quickly as those operators did. It was very impressive, and that too is a story worth telling.
It's unfortunate that Carlo is no longer with us. I wanted to ask him, given the noise being made south of us, especially directed at China, are we in a position to be becoming a preferred supplier as opposed to perhaps one that's not so preferred relative to, say, Brazil or other places? He's not here, so I know he can't answer the question.
If only we had good relationships with China.
Yeah, well, that's another issue, isn't it?
I think I was the guy who mentioned the flood, Richard, and I think that, or sorry, Robert, that I do think that part of our reputation was how quickly we responded to that. That's part of a good reputation in terms of that was a pretty drastic event, and we just had Farm Management Canada's meetings in Abbotsford, and they were talking about the farmers that went through that, and we were talking about risk mitigation, and their only response was, we need more
Weird how that disappears.
Municipal investments are the real. Sorry, the municipal investments in mitigation was the only major thing that she could think of making any change. Like, it was such a difficult event to go through that. So I did want to flag that as a potential. But the other thing you talked about, and one of the things that Carlo talked about in his response to some of the comments about what he was hearing, was that it's difficult to actually measure the reputation. And it's difficult for us to measure how well we're doing. Even you were talking about productivity. It does seem like data is a relatively, I don't know, I think it's relatively low cost way to get started, get us academics working on the data.
Data is always valuable. I mean, I think the reputational issue is real, right? We hear it through the Trade Commissioner Service. We hear it through business. Business will quantify it for you in different ways, because at time it can be it could be a loss of market share, or it could be a price discount in negotiations that reflects perceived risk of doing business with the country, or with a particular enterprise and their ability to deliver, right? And so there are different ways to get at it, but we're more focused on what do we do about it. We've got the problem. We know we want to strengthen the resiliency and the efficiency of our supply chains, and that's why we've laid out, those areas of work. The labor issue, and Jill encapsulated, I think, the tangible impacts and the frustration of many. We do need to understand what are the root causes, and what pressures and what can change in dynamics to reduce the brinkmanship that's been occurring around labor negotiations, because it is not just the act of a strike or a lockout, but as Jill said, it's the prospective uncertainty around an outcome that causes people to begin to enact what at times can be quite costly contingency plans in their logistics chains. And so it would be good if Canada could find ways to dial down that pressure. It is unfortunately not as there's no silver bullet sort of solution here. The right to strike is constitutionally protected. Like it or not, you can't actually remove that right and remove that risk. So what do we look at to understand what are the root causes? Why is it coming to this? What is the structure of bargaining? What is in the process? And that's on employers and organized labor, as well as on the government frameworks around that, and the environment. Like, let's look at all of that to understand how we can get a more predictable labor environment, because what we do here is that it's very hard to explain our particular labor context. Although we do note that it's not as if, to your point of international comparisons and benchmarking, I don't think I've ever been to France when somebody hasn't been on strike. Like in France, the U.S. Has had significant West and East Coast labor disruptions. The automotive sector is a regular occurrence. We are not the only country in this space, but we do have a reputational issue to address.
Thanks. I do think that we have allowed this. I'm stealing an idea from Barry here that I'm pretty sure he told me about this as a logical flow, that we've allowed two major railways to capture a lot of economies of scale so that they could be relatively efficient. But then our entire country is at risk when both of those two railways are blocked up. And so it does, to me, it sort of starts to meet the rules of an emergency service. Like I think we have to maybe change the status of that labor in terms of how important it is to the whole economy.
Well, I'm not going to engage in a debate around labor law, but you can't actually do that.
Okay.
That is the upshot, and then there's also the where do you stop with that? What goods are essential? It's a long discussion. It may not be what people want to hear, but I think the solution set lies with actually going a bit deeper, and looking at the processes, the structure of bargaining, the labor code, other things that apply for pressure, long before we ever get to the point of needing powers to deal with a strike or like what is it early on that precludes their 2-year pre-bargaining periods. What exactly is what's going on that is inhibiting agreements from being reached at the table? And we don't say that language easily. I mean, it is the most stable agreements are the ones that parties enter into willingly. Those are the ones that endure, and it's because then there's a good underlying trusted and strong relationship, and you grapple with the issues. If that's not happening, we need to ask ourselves why. And I know colleagues are doing work on that. That's partly what the Minister of Labor's Section 106 process is looking at, the industrial, I'll get the name wrong, but the Industrial Labor Relations Committee looking at the West Coast longshore issues.
Thanks for that answer. So we do have one last question in the chat from Chris about de-risking from sort of a point of view of the environment. I mean, I think that the BC corridor investment on flood protection is one of them, but is there other things that are sort of system-wide that are part of your thinking, Robert, or Jill?
Well, the good news here, I think, is, the railways own their infrastructure, governments own highways and tend to own bridges, their ports and terminals who own marine infrastructure. And as everybody's recapitalizing those or rebuilding, there's a general sense people are assessing that risk environment, the climate risk, and everybody knows that what used to be a 100-year flood is now a 5-year flood. All that kind of stuff. People have to look at that. If as a nation you want to accelerate that, I mean, that requires significant investment, but you'd also bump up against, to be blunt, constraints in like industry capacity, construction industry, personnel, all of the rest to do those build outs. But we methodically need to make sure we're building to those new standards. And my sense is that it's a part of almost every conversation that I'm in, and people are very much thinking that way.
Great, thanks. Jill, are you on the farm? You talked about environmental planning. Are you preparing for climate risk?
I think that's having that plan on the farm and owning that as to when you're able to make those investments. It's no different than when you look at the big picture where you have investment in infrastructure across the province and across Canada. I think one of the struggles that I see even on capacity for truck traffic in the province with our heavy reliance on and a lot of the short lines being taken away as options for transportation of rail, the increased reliance of using the roads and structures that are there, and the ability to catch up. And I think it was Carlos that had mentioned, trying to catch up, trying to fix those emergency fixes. And I think we're constantly in a state of using those investment dollars short term and not having a long-term vision to one of the things that he mentioned, to encourage investment by not only government but private sectors into the future. And so I think we have to look at things like he had mentioned, bigger. We have to step back and look at it bigger and not be playing catch up all the time to fix those short term and then not having the funds to actually make real meaningful fixes to the infrastructure that we currently have, which I think we need to have a plan if we want to grow certainly the on the production side and on agriculture and moving product. We have to have the infrastructure to move it.
Thanks. All right, there's room for one more question. Barry, I bet you do have one.
Well, no, more of a comment, I think. I've heard it said that only rich countries can afford democracy. It's because it's kind of messy. You have to deal with everybody's interests and complaints and freedoms and free enterprise, as well as labor organizations and unions. And that's just part of being a democracy. But we're also very resilient. You know, if you look around the world and at a few places that are in chaos, they're not democracies. And, you know, the great advantage that we do have is that we can change and we're open to information, ideas, and so on. So I think this the conversation we've just had illustrates the fact that we can get these kinds of ideas and problems out on the table. We're not afraid to discuss them. And of course, that's identifying a problem is the first half of solving it. So I think, you know, I would say in terms of our supply chains, they have had shocks. We know that a lot of costs have gone up, not just labor, interest rates, as well as other expenses of fuel that have gone through. And so we have had a challenging few years, but I think we are coming to more stability as time goes on. Having said that, we'll see what holds for us with Mr. Trump and company is there's a new challenge coming on, but I'm sure we will ride that out too, for the same reason that we do have a resilient economy and one that can adapt and change. And as Robert pointed out, you know, we do have that advantage of being nimble. You know, we're not that big that we can't get everybody together. If we got a real problem, we can put our focus on it and solve it. So at least I'm encouraged, put it that way.
Your mic is off, Robert. Did you want to respond?
No, I was just gonna thank Barry for that. I mean, you know, and it's true, you know, I get the privilege of being part of a lot of conversations with a lot of folks who bring different perspectives. And when I talk to people who do business in or with Canada, who also transact business or run operations in other countries around the world, they you know, they're often much more complimentary about Canadian rail service or the challenges that we put up. You know, we are more bureaucratic and regulatory and have higher standards with which to comply. But as somebody said, nobody kidnaps my family or holds my employees hostage while we're doing a negotiation. Our lives are not at risk. There is not corruption. When a decision is taken, the decision sticks, or if it's unfair, you know how to appeal it, and it's transparent, fair. You know, we do have advantages, and ultimately, people will pay and have paid and will keep paying premiums to do business with a jurisdiction like this that has quality goods that come from our many producers, small business, farms, enterprises, or natural resources. We need to do better at reliability, but you know, the quality of our goods, price is a bit forgivable. People want reliability right now in the supply chain, and we're working away at that. So thank you, Barry, for that comment.
Well, that sounds like a great place to wrap up. And thank you very much, Robert and Jill, and out there in the ether. Thank you, Carlo, for a great discussion. And Barry, I think it's time for us to move on to the next session.
In fact, it's perfect timing. Yeah, thank you so much, Derek, for sharing this, and thank you to the panel. It's been a very engaging and interesting session.